The next bill on the calendar for the day is House File 70. The clerk will report the bill.
House File number 70, number 4 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to public safety, the first engrossment.
There are no amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File number 70.
Third reading. I recognize the author of the bill, the member from Ramsey, Representative Kunesh Padin, to explain her bill.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, members. Members, we are here because we're problem solvers. We are here to solve the problems in healthcare, in education, agriculture, transportation. We're here to ensure that we are taking the very best care of all of the people that live in Minnesota. But unfortunately in Minnesota and across the nation, we have a really big problem. I want you to imagine that you are a young Native American girl, maybe 13 years old, or a young Native American woman. And your biggest problem should be going to the prom, what should I wear, or planning your future. But unfortunately, for so many of our Native American women, they're working really hard to stay alive by the time they reach their early 30s. This is a real issue. This is a true issue in our Native American communities across the United States, and unfortunately it's here in Minnesota as well. Because the facts are that for all of our mothers, our Native mothers, our aunts, our grandmas, our sisters, their girlfriends, murder is the third leading cause of death for Native American women aged 10 to 24. In some areas, Native American women are murdered at a rate 10 times the national average. And members, what's really hard is that Native American women are assaulted 2.5 to 3.5 times more than any other demographic of women. Native American women, girls, men, boys, and two-spirits, no one exactly knows how many that are victims of this, this violence. Nobody knows how many go missing across the nation or in Minnesota. We don't know how many are dead. This is a real historic endemic, and it is directly linked to a confusing jurisdictional maze, lack of resources, and unfortunately, indifference in many areas. So I'm going to tell you about JoJo Boswell, and maybe some of you heard her sister's testimony in our committee. JoJo went missing in 2005. She was arrested in Hennepin County and taken to Owatonna. When she was released, she called her sister, and that was the last time her sister ever heard from her. On July 11th of that year, when she was released, she never made it back to Minneapolis, and we don't know why. Her sister Dolly reported her missing, but she was told she had to wait another 48 hours by the police. She waited those 48 hours, and it got all jammed up due to the discrepancies in the responsibility between the Owatonna and Minneapolis jurisdictional in the police force. Imagine hearing from a law enforcement when your loved one has gone missing to be told, call me when she returns home. JoJo never returned home. She's never been seen or heard from since that day. I'm going to tell you about Misty. Misty has been at every one of the committees to testify, and she's up in the balcony today. Misty was just 9 years old when she was first assaulted by the boyfriend of her foster mother. When she was 12 years old, she witnessed her grandmother being murdered in front of her, and then she watched her attacker go after her mother and then after her. Misty still has the scars on her hands as she defended herself. When she was 20 years old, she was kidnapped. She was taken over 60 miles from her home, and she was held against her will, was raped, but she finally got away. Misty is from Minnesota. JoJo is from Minnesota. Misty is continuing to fight for indigenous rights today. And then I want you to remember Savannah Graywin from Fargo, South Dakota. On August 19, 2017, Savannah went missing. She vanished without a trace. She was 8 months pregnant. We, the Native community, are very tightly connected when it comes to social media. We knew about her missing. We heard about it. We read the pleas to please find Savannah. But it was days before the media picked up on that. And they picked up not because it was a Native American girl that went missing, but here was a woman who was pregnant, who's gone missing. So, heartbreakingly, Savannah's body was discovered 8 days later, thrown in the Red River. It was 3 days after her 5-day-old daughter was found in an upstairs apartment building. Savannah's baby had been cut from her womb, kept by this family or this couple, and Savannah's body was just discarded into the river. Closer to home and most recently, Amber Christine Hopkins. I would be really curious to know if any of you have heard her name or if you know her story. Because this happened just this month in January 14th. And Amber was 5 months pregnant when she disappeared. And again, I wonder how many of you know this story. Her body was finally found on March 26th in the backyard of a vacant house in another part of the city from where she lived. I imagine that very few of you are familiar with these tragedies, but unfortunately, it is the story that so many Native American families and communities understand so well. I can't tell you how many of these stories along the way that I have heard. Over a year ago, or last session, I introduced this bill with the help of some of our colleagues along on the other side of the aisle. And I so appreciated the support that all of you gave me and gave all of these victims and this bill as we've gone on. So we have an opportunity at long last to join an international discussion. It's not just local, it's just not national. This is an international issue centered on the disappearance and murders of indigenous women. Members, we have an opportunity today to be a problem solver. With journalists and activists presenting alarming evidence that can no longer be ignored, I would ask you to join me in demanding accountability. In Minnesota, there are 7 Anishinaabe reservations and 4 Dakota communities. American Indians in Minnesota number approximately over 60,000 or 1.1% of Minnesota's total population. Yet the Urban Indian History Institute ranked Minnesota the 9th highest in the missing and murdered indigenous women incidences. Research has found that 56% of Native women experience violence in their lifetime. In actuality, those predators of our Native women are not Native men. 9 out of 10 victims designate their assailants to be non-Native assaults. Men who will never be caught, will never be punished, who will continue to do it again and again because they know that Native American women are vulnerable, they're invisible, and they're afraid half the time to report the injustices that are done to them. We know of some of the reasons that so many missing and murdered indigenous women's cases go unreported, uninvestigated, and unsolved, but we don't know how many women are actually missing or have been murdered. It is estimated that thousands of Native women have disappeared or been killed. And members, we owe it to our Native community. We owe it to this nation to recognize and address this historic trauma. So this bill, House File 70, is the very first step in understanding the significance of our missing and murdered Indigenous communities and bringing an end to this really, really, really horrific violence. It creates a task force to address the violence against Indigenous women, and it defines the standards and requirements of that task force. This task force will be responsible for examining and reporting ways to address the systematic causes behind the violence against Indigenous women. It appropriates methods for tracking and collecting data. It examines government policies and institutions that impact violence against Indigenous women. And it's going to recommend appropriate measures to address the violence and assist the victims and their 11 families. It will also include victims, survivors, Indian community members, and also those that have worked hard with eradicating this violence against women. It will also include membership from all 11 tribes. So we're trying to make the invisible visible. We don't want any more Native American families to worry and wonder if their loved ones will return home when they walk out the door. So members, I'm asking you to be problem solvers. I'm asking you to join me, and I know many of you had. I'm asking you to vote green.
Discussion. The member from Ramsey, Representative Becker-Finn.
Niju Anakwa Dukwe Nadij Dakaz Makwa Nindodem Leech Lake Nindunjaba. Madam Speaker, members, miigwech to all the survivors who have come forward to share their stories, the stories of your murdered mothers and missing sisters. I don't know an Indigenous woman who has not been personally impacted by violence, myself included. Your stories matter, and we hear you. As I shared in the first hearing for this bill last year, my great-grandmother Josephine was brutally murdered as a young mom in my hometown of Cass Lake, leaving behind her children, including my then 5-year-old grandma, my Grandma Alverna. And that trauma impacted my Grandma Alverna her whole life, and it impacts my family today. But the thing is, my family's story is not actually unique. As Representative Kunesh-Bodine spoke to, I don't know a Native family that has not been impacted, similarly impacted by violence like mine. The most important part, though, is that my family and every Native family, we are more than our trauma. We are more than sad stories or victims or relics of history. We are survivors. If there is one thing our people are good at, it is surviving in the face of all odds. We are still here. We have always been here, and we will continue to be here in Minnesota. That's what we do. The truth is that the system, the culture we all live in, is more accepting of Indigenous women as victims than as leaders. The truth is that the system is more accepting of Indigenous women as invisible than as speaking up and speaking the truth. And I refuse for that reality to be the continued reality for future generations of Native girls, for my daughter Vida, for Siobhan and Mika and Evie and all the girls we are raising today. I'm using a lot of names today because I do want to make the point that these are real, full human beings with families that we're talking about. They are not just statistics. These are our families and loved ones, our friends and neighbors. And they will be impacted by this issue and this bill. This bill is the first step to working towards making things right and making things better for our Native communities. So for Josephine and my Grandma Alverna and Vida and Siobhan, please vote yes. Chi miigwech.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Hertas.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and Representative Kanesh Padin. Thank you for bringing this bill forward. When I saw that you had introduced it, I was quick to become a co-author as well. Representative Becker-Finn, thank you for your advocacy on this issue as well. Members, our American culture, we value our women and our children. And we need to do everything we can to protect them and find out what the problems are. Whether it's FGM or whether it's sex trafficking or whether it's pornography or anything else that demeans women, we need to renounce that, and we need to make sure that it ends. This is not a partisan issue, and we want to make sure that you are able to find the problem here and that we address it. Thank you.
The member from Isanti, Representative Johnson.
Madam Speaker, members, this is a serious issue that's happening. And I want to thank Representative Kanesh Padin for bringing this back again last year. There's a lot of tragedy happening in this situation. But what really unfortunate is this task force should already be running. It should be up and running. It was unfortunately vetoed by Governor Dayton last year. And with what's happening there is very serious. We need to get this task force done. I urge everybody to vote green.
The member from Stearns, Representative O'Driscoll.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. And as many of you know on this House floor, Representative Kanesh Padin and I grew up 2 blocks from one another in a small city called Sartell. She moved out, I stayed, for whatever that's worth, right, Representative? And her brother and I graduated from high school together. I know the Kanesh family very well. And I also have cousins who are indigenous. And I think about how fortunate my 4 cousins, who are females, who didn't have to go through the tragedy that we're hearing on the House floor today. Last year, when I was the chair of the Government Operations Committee and I was looking at bills, I saw Representative Kanesh Padin's bill. I went to her and I said, we can get you a hearing on that in the Government Operations Committee. And during the busy time of bill hearing, we scheduled a hearing. And as Representative Becker-Finn said, there were witnesses that were brought into that first committee hearing meeting, and we were the first one to hear that. And if you could have heard those stories, they literally would have turned your stomach. It's hard for me to believe that we treat people like this in the 21st century. The brutality that is still tolerated of people against people. It's just unbelievable. And as soon as I had the hearing on this, I went to then Chair Johnson and I said, I know everybody's asking you for money, Representative Johnson, but this one you have to find spot for. We need money in the public safety budget. And I barely got the sentence out of my mouth and he said, we're with you. We'll find a spot for it. As Representative Johnson said, that bill passed off the House floor last year. It was part of the public safety omnibus bill. This is just another one of those provisions that was in that omnibus bill last year that got vetoed. And here we are, another whole year later having to deal with these kinds of things. Another whole year later where we don't know how many, as the subject of this bill talks about, indigenous women who are murdered and missing that we don't even know about. I'm hoping that with Governor Walz we have a fresh start and that we look at these kinds of bills on their merits. Members, I can't encourage you enough to vote yes, to do the right thing in the 21st century. Thank you, Madam Speaker and members.
The member from Dakota, Representative Halverson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Representative Kanesh Padin, Representative Becker-Finn, for being here. When we heard this bill in committee, in government operations, I started to cry and kind of couldn't stop. not just because of the stories that we heard, which were horrible, but for the fact that we had a path, finally, for these women to speak truth to power. These stories aren't new. These stories have been going on for generations, as Representative Becker-Finn said. But here we are today with Native women representing communities at the Minnesota legislature. And so I was struck so much by the power that bringing new people into our body has made with regard to the conversations that we have and with regard to the differences that we get to make in people's lives. And I'm very proud and very grateful to be able to stand with these women and let our Native sisters know that we see you and we hear you and we care. And I'm very excited to vote yes for you and for generations of women in Minnesota who spent far too much time in the shadows. Thank you.
Further discussion? Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the bill. The clerk will close the roll. There being 128 ayes and 0 nays, the bill is passed and its title agreed to.